Nora's heart fluttered with joy as Mrs. Duru guided her through the colorful aisles of the mall. It was the first time Nora had ever been shopping, and she could hardly contain her excitement. She eagerly picked out toys and clothes, imagining how happy she would be to return home with all the beautiful things. Mrs. Duru seemed to be enjoying the day as well, her eyes twinkling with kindness and patience. However, as time went on, Mrs. Duru began to take longer and longer to return. Nora, who had been eagerly waiting near the toy section, grew increasingly anxious. The minutes ticked by, and Mrs. Duru's absence became more pronounced. Nora's excitement slowly turned into worry as the store's bright lights seemed to dim around her. After what felt like an eternity, Nora's worry turned into dread. Mrs. Duru still hadn't returned, and the reality began to sink in. Nora's heart pounded as the realization struck her. Mrs. Duru had brought her to the mall with the intention of abandoning her. Tears welled up in Nora's eyes, spilling over as her fear and confusion reached a breaking point. This was the most terrifying moment of her life, far worse than anything she had ever experienced. Feeling utterly betrayed, Nora clutched her brown teddy bear tightly, seeking comfort in its familiar softness. The world around her felt vast and menacing, and she felt utterly alone. The mall, once a place of excitement, now seemed an intimidating labyrinth. Nora wished desperately that she could disappear or that someone would rescue her from this nightmare. Back at home, Mr. Duru arrived and noticed an unsettling silence in the house. His concern grew as he realized Mrs. Duru was not downstairs. He went to Nora's room, only to find it empty. "Where is Nora?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Mrs. Duru, who had been waiting in her room, feigned ignorance. "I don't know where Nora is," she replied coolly. "I'm not her keeper." Mr. Duru's concern quickly turned to panic as he began calling out for Nora, his voice echoing through the house. The growing sense of dread only intensified as he searched frantically. Mrs. Duru sat alone in her room, her mind racing with the memory of a family friend's comment at the mall, "She looks so much like your husband." Those words echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. MRS. Mrs. Duru's suspicion that Nora might be her husband's secret child intensified. The sight of Mr. Duru's panic only fueled her belief that he had brought Nora into their home under false pretenses, disguising his secret as an act of charity. Determined to confirm her suspicions, Mrs. Duru decided to take matters into her own hands. She collected samples for a paternity test and submitted them to a trusted friend at a lab. The results were clear. Mr. Duru was indeed Nora's father. "I knew it," Mrs. Duru muttered to herself, a mix of anger and vindication in her voice. When she confronted Mr. Duru with the test results, her voice trembled with fury. "You see, I was right all along," she yelled. "You've been deceiving me into caring for another woman's child." Mr. Duru, taken aback by her rage, said nothing. He simply retreated to his room and locked the door behind him, leaving Mrs. Duru seething with anger and disbelief. Sitting alone on the living room sofa, Mrs. Duru was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. The depth of her husband's deception was overwhelming. She remembered the visit to Nora's mother's house and how Mr. Duru had acted as if he had no idea who Nora's mother was. No wonder she never came to the hospital, Mrs. Duru thought bitterly. He was pretending not to know. "I've been completely fooled." The following morning, Mrs. Duru sat alone in the living room, her mind still reeling from the revelations. Her husband emerged from his room, grabbing his car keys with a determined stride. "Where are you going?" she asked, but he ignored her and drove away. "I knew it, he's going to meet his mistress," Mrs. Duru thought, her suspicions reigniting. She grabbed her own keys and decided to follow him, her curiosity driving her forward. Mrs. Duru trailed her husband discreetly, following him to Nora's mother's house. From a distance, she watched as her husband approached the door and knocked. To her shock and disbelief, Nora's mother answered. Mrs. Duru's feelings of betrayal intensified as she saw her husband interacting with this woman. Feeling deeply deceived, Mrs. Duru watched from her car as her husband and Nora's mother argued briefly before entering the house together. Her heart ached with the realization of the depth of her husband's deception. Overcome with emotion, she decided to return home. But as she prepared to leave, she saw her husband and Nora's mother emerge from the house and drive off together. This is interesting, Mrs. Duru said to herself, her curiosity piqued despite her tears. She continued to follow them, determined to uncover the truth. They arrived at a family hospital and went inside together. Mrs. Duru, now driven by a desperate need for answers, followed them into the hospital. Inside, she saw her husband and Nora's mother speaking with a doctor. Driven by a mix of anxiety and determination, Mrs. Duru approached them, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Mr. Duru, surprised to see her, asked how she had found them, but she dismissed his question, insisting on knowing why they were at the hospital. It was then that Mr. Duru revealed the startling truth: Nora was their child. Mrs. Duru's eyes widened in shock as she tried to comprehend the revelation. The hospital staff explained that Nora had been swapped at birth with another baby. An unscrupulous nurse had committed the swap and destroyed the medical records, making it challenging to trace the affected families. The hospital had eventually reported the case to the authorities, who arrested and convicted the nurse for her crimes. The doctor apologized profusely for the misunderstanding and distress caused to Mr. and Mrs. Duru, as well as to Nora. Mrs. Duru stood there, unable to speak, her mind reeling. Nora, the girl she had harbored so much resentment for, was her own daughter, a child she had never known existed until this very moment. Heartbroken and overwhelmed with guilt, Mrs. Duru realized the gravity of her actions. She had abandoned her own daughter in the midst of a busy moor. Her heart ached with the fear and worry of where Nora might be and if she was safe. Without a second thought, Mrs. Duru raced out of the hospital and drove back to the moor. Arriving at the store, she frantically inquired with every staff member about Nora's whereabouts. Despite her desperate pleas, no one had seen Nora. Mrs. Duru's anguish reached a crescendo as she screamed in despair, unable to comprehend the magnitude of her actions driven by jealousy and anger. Meanwhile, Mr. Duru, concerned about his wife's sudden departure, called her phone, anxiously trying to locate her.